Hello there. Welcome to my weekly meditation. And know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. This is a weekly video that I do for my congregation in South Burlington. And so if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and you find this video helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, or share these videos with anyone you feel called to. Our reading for this week is from Matthew 16, verses 21 through 28. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? And what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Hello, brothers and sisters. Thank you again for checking out this weekly meditation that I'm putting together. And today we're going to be continuing our exploration of Matthew chapter 16. And this particular passage is about Jesus preparing his disciples and his followers for his ministry in Jerusalem. And he's telling them, look, we're going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And honestly, I don't really think he needed to be able to see the future to be able to put those pieces together. The folks who were in control of Jerusalem at that time didn't like Jesus, they didn't like his message, and it was a pretty safe bet for Jesus to say to his disciples, if we go to this city, things are probably not going to turn out very well for me, maybe not even for you. So when Peter takes Jesus aside and says, this is a really bad idea, we don't want you to die, I think that the way that Jesus responds to Peter, and I think that the subject that this entire thing brings up, speaks a lot to our own senses of self-preservation. I think it also speaks to our understanding of what is sane, insane, crazy, or reasonable. It really does speak to human definitions of what makes sense and divine definitions of what makes sense. And Jesus is doing something interesting here. Jesus is quantifying his life and his worth on a very divine level, which I think we as human beings struggle to recognize or to live into in our own lives. And so let's talk about it. So the first thing I want to point out about this passage is after Jesus tells his disciples that he plans on going to Jerusalem where they're probably going to kill him, Peter very reasonably and understandably takes Jesus aside and tells him, this is a bad idea. If you get killed, that's horrible. And we get this reaction from Jesus where he says to Peter, "Step aside, Satan." And while I do feel that seems kind of harsh, I also think that what Jesus is saying is kind of true. Because what Jesus is talking about, this desire that he has to go to Jerusalem, is rooted, I feel, in his desire to live his life fully into the will of God. And he is not looking at his life through, as I said, what I feel are human definitions. Rather, he's looking at how his life can be the most useful to God that it can be. And in doing so, he's trying to I feel, maximize the amount of love that he can give to the world through his life. And I think at this point in his ministry, he just realizes that he can do the most good in Jerusalem, even if it means sacrificing his own life. The amount of good that he could do for the world there makes the sacrifice worth it. And so, what Peter is trying to communicate to Jesus is, well, this doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to your disciples. It doesn't make sense to your followers. Why would you go to a place where they are going to kill you? And I think that when Jesus says to Peter, you're being influenced by something that is pulling you away from God, when he says, get away from me, Satan, he's saying that your desire to preserve my life, your sense of self-preservation, is rooted in something that is human and not godly. And that if you were to look at what we're doing from the eyes of God and what God wants for the world, you probably would be able to better see that sometimes what is good for us as individuals is not as important as what we can give to others. I mean, this is very the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few sort of stuff. But I also think that it's about trying to live our lives in the service of God and in the service of trying to do good for the world, as opposed to living just for ourselves. So when Jesus says those who are willing to lose their life will find it, I really do think that what he's trying to say is that to God our lives do have value and our lives have purpose. And if we are able to recognize the value and the purpose of that life to God, how would we choose to live that life with that information in mind? Jesus is an interesting example because for us as Christians, he represents a person who fully understood his worth, fully understood his purpose, and fully understood that the sacrifice that he was making was a good one. Because he would, in exchange for his life, give us, human beings, an example of love that we would be able to hold on to far past his death, and even an example of love through his resurrection. It's hard for us to enter into that type of mindset that Jesus must have been in when he made that decision to go to Jerusalem. It's hard for us as people living human lives to see wisdom or sense in going to a place where people want to kill you. But I think that this passage is trying to show us that what makes sense to God is not always going to make sense to us. And if we just keep doing things that make sense to us as human beings, that's not always going to lead us to God. And so, how do we open up our heads, our minds, in this particular instance, to God so that we can better live into the love that's in our hearts? I don't know if that's an easy thing to answer. I don't know if I'm fully able to do that myself. I know that there are people within history who have fully lived into that example of love, and not all of them were Christians. I think Gandhi is a good example of somebody who fully lived into love and understood that he probably would be killed in the process of trying to bring freedom to the people of India. I also believe that Dr. King probably understood that the work that he was doing could lead to his death, and yet he was willing to be vocal as Jesus was about his message of love and civil liberties for people of color and all people within this country in the face of immense hate. And we within the Progressive Church often look to that civil rights era as an example of how we as people in the modern era can live into the call of Jesus Christ. But I think here in the modern era, when we're talking about the 21st century, we are struggling to live into that call. I think that we are struggling to recognize the realities of God's love as opposed to the reason and understandings of humanity that are comfortable with us. And so we talked a little bit last week about the way in which states are rewriting history to make them feel more comfortable with it and to ignore the struggles of minority groups within this country. We've talked about the way in which we are choosing to ignore issues that speak to the equity and fairness and justice for people who are transgender, whether or not they can participate in school sports, or whether or not they even have the right to gender affirming care. We have been having discussions about issues of women's health and whether or not a woman should have access to an abortion. And in particular, I know that in my town of Georgia and in many places here in Vermont, we're having discussions about whether or not towns should be promoting fairness and equity. And people are struggling to really understand, well, how does that make sense? And I think that when we think about things from a sense of self-preservation, very often doing things for others does not make sense. And this is where I feel we really should be paying attention to this passage. Our desire to look out for ourselves, to look out for those that are like us, or to look out for our group, very often can be the voice of Satan calling us away from doing good for others. And that voice can be saying, well, if you give to others in this way, your taxes are going to go up. That might make people angry. If you give to others in this way, your neighborhood's going to look a little bit differently. If you give to others in this way, you're going to see more poor people on the streets, and they're going to need help. Well, those things are not always as serious as, well, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to die. But they are things that just as much can cause us to step away from the call of doing what is right, what is good, what is loving, and what could be beneficial to a lot of other people. And so I think we as Christians need to ask ourselves this question: how far are we willing to go to embrace our call from God? And I think we are going to come to different answers. Sometimes maybe the call of God is not going to ask us to sacrifice our lives the way in which Jesus felt called to sacrifice his. And sometimes the call of God might be asking us to sacrifice maybe something more than our lives, to live our entire lives maybe into a message of justice, to give up our jobs, to take on another profession like trying to protect the environment, or trying to be an advocate for people who are coming out of the prison system, or trying to be an advocate for, again, people who are living with disabilities, or people who are struggling with racial injustice. There are a lot of people who choose, instead of living their lives in a way that maximizes what is good for them, to live their lives in a way that will help maximize the good of others. And I think that that is what Jesus is doing right here. And I think that we don't need to just look to these big, bombshell examples of people who have done that as well, like Dr. King or Gandhi, or other folks like even Mother Teresa, to see this within the world. People actually do it all the time. And it's good for us to recognize that and to ask ourselves, maybe we can do this too. Maybe we can embrace that crazy concept of living a life that is in service of God's love. And you know what? That just might change the world. Amen.